Before the world ever heard that famous whistle, before millions of people sang Wind of Change like a prayer for peace, there was one night in Moscow when the Scorpions stood on a stage and realized something impossible was happening. It was not just another concert. It was not just another loud summer night with guitars, drums, smoke, and screaming fans. For Klaus Meine, Rudolf Schenker, Matthias Jobs, Francis Buchholz, and Hermann Rarabell, Moscow in 1989 felt like standing at the edge of history, while history was still deciding what it wanted to become. And no one in that stadium knew it yet. Not the young Russian fans pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath the lights. Not the soldiers watching from the edges. Not the Western rock stars who had flown into the Soviet Union with their amplifiers, their leather jackets, their wild reputations, and their old Cold War assumptions. And, perhaps, not even Klaus himself. But somewhere in that noise, somewhere between fear and hope, a song was beginning to breathe. A song that did not yet have a title. A song that did not yet have lyrics. A song that would one day become bigger than the band itself. But before Wind of Change became an anthem, it was only a feeling. And that feeling began in a place most Western rock bands had once believed they would never reach: Moscow. For decades, the Soviet Union had been more than a country to people in the West. It had been an idea wrapped in suspicion, a shadow on the evening news, a word spoken in serious voices by presidents, generals, teachers, fathers, and frightened children who grew up under the threat of nuclear war. Americans of a certain age remember that feeling. The drills, the headlines, the Berlin Wall, the maps colored in red and blue, the sense that the world was divided by something colder than distance. And Scorpions understood that division in a very personal way. They were German. They came from a land that knew what walls could do to families, cities, and souls. They had grown up in the long shadow of war. They had carried the weight of a country trying to rebuild itself, trying to be heard again, trying to prove that a new generation could make a different kind of noise. Not the noise of marching boots, the noise of guitars. That was always part of the Scorpions' story. Beneath the leather and the screaming solos, beneath the arena lights and the wild album covers, there was a group of men from post-war Germany trying to reach the world. And for years, the world did not make it easy. They played tiny clubs. They traveled in uncomfortable vans. They fought the language barrier. They crossed borders with cheap luggage and expensive dreams. They wanted the British rock fans to listen. They wanted the Americans to understand. They wanted to prove that a German band could stand on the same stage as the giants. And slowly, painfully, they did. But Moscow was different. Moscow was not just another market. Moscow was not just another city on a tour schedule. Moscow was the other side of the wall. And when Scorpions arrived there in 1989, the air already felt strange. The Soviet Union was changing, though no one could say how far the change would go. There were new words in the world now: perestroika, glasnost, reform, openness, possibility. But possibility can be dangerous. Because when people begin to imagine a different life, everything becomes unstable. The old world does not disappear quietly. And yet, on that night, the young people of Moscow were not thinking like politicians. They were thinking like fans. They wanted music. They wanted release. They wanted to shout in a language older than politics and stronger than borders. Rock and roll had reached them even when governments tried to keep it away. It came through records passed from hand to hand. It came through radio signals. It came through rumors, bootlegs, posters, and whispered names. Scorpions, Bon Jovi, Ozzy, Motley Crue. Names that sounded like freedom to kids who had spent their lives being told what freedom was supposed to mean. And when the Moscow Music Peace Festival opened its gates, something extraordinary happened. The Iron Curtain did not fall that day, but it trembled. Imagine Klaus Meine walking through Moscow in August heat, looking at faces that should have felt foreign to him, but somehow did not. Young men with long hair, girls smiling through nervous excitement, soldiers trying to look stern while the sound of guitars rolled across the air. Everywhere he looked, Klaus saw contradiction. A city still heavy with Soviet symbols. A crowd full of young people who wanted the future. A government trying to control an event that could not be controlled once the music began. And perhaps that was the first secret of that night. The concert was not powerful because it was perfect. It was powerful because it was imperfect, because there was tension in it, because everyone could feel the old world still standing, and the new one pressing against it from the inside. When Scorpions stepped onto that stage, they were not boys anymore. They had survived too much to be naive. Klaus had nearly lost the one thing that made him Klaus Meine, his voice. Years earlier, before blackout, his voice had almost disappeared. For a singer, that is not an injury. It is a death sentence, and the band had faced a choice many bands never survive. Replace him, move on, save the machine. But Rudolf Schenker and the others waited. They believed in Klaus when Klaus could barely believe in himself. That loyalty mattered in Moscow, because when Klaus looked out at that sea of Russian faces, he was not looking at strangers from an enemy land. He was looking at people who understood waiting for permission, waiting for change. Waiting for the day when the world might finally stop telling them who they were supposed to hate. And then the music began. The sound hit the stadium like a door being kicked open. Guitars screamed into the night. Drums rolled like thunder. The crowd surged. For a moment, politics lost its grip. Not completely. Never completely. But enough. Enough for a young Russian fan to raise both hands and shout the lyrics of a German band. Enough for soldiers to forget their posture. Enough for Klaus to feel something move through the crowd that was larger than fame. This was not the usual kind of rock star worship. This was hunger, not for celebrity, for connection. And that is what changed him. Because Klaus Meine had sung in front of wild crowds before. He had seen American arenas shake. He had heard European festivals roar. He knew what applause sounded like. But this was different. This applause carried history inside it. Every scream seemed to say, "We are still here." Every hand in the air seemed to say, "Do not forget us." Every face in that stadium seemed to ask the same quiet question. Can the world really change? And Klaus did not have an answer. Not yet. He only had the feeling that something invisible was passing over Moscow. A wind, maybe. Not a storm. Not a revolution with tanks and speeches. Something softer. Something that moved through people before it moved through governments. That night, the Scorpions were not just performing songs. They were witnessing a crack in the Cold War, and cracks can be more powerful than explosions, because explosions destroy what stands in front of them. Cracks reveal what was always underneath. After the show, the noise did not simply end. It stayed in the body. That is something only people who lived through great concerts understand. A concert ends, but the sound remains. It follows you into the hallway. It follows you into the car. It follows you into the hotel room when the lights are off and everyone else is asleep. For Klaus, Moscow did not fade when the amplifiers went silent. It grew louder. He had seen something that would not leave him alone. A Russian crowd singing with a German band. Western musicians standing on Soviet ground. Young people behaving as though the future had already arrived, even if the newspapers had not announced it yet. And in that strange emotional afterglow, Klaus began to understand something. Maybe the song was not supposed to be about politics. Maybe it was not supposed to argue. Maybe it was not supposed to explain East and West, capitalism and communism, power and ideology. Maybe it was supposed to capture one human moment. The moment when enemies stop looking like enemies. That is much harder to write than a protest song. A protest song points a finger. Wind of Change opened a hand. And that may be why it lasted. It did not sound like victory. It sounded like hope before hope was safe. That is the part people sometimes forget. By the time Wind of Change became famous, the world had already attached meaning to it. The Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the strange relief of watching history move in a direction that seemed almost merciful. But when Klaus first felt the idea forming, none of that was guaranteed. The wall still stood. Old fears still lived. The Soviet Union had not yet collapsed. No one knew what would happen next. That is what makes the story so powerful. The song came from uncertainty, not certainty. It came from a man standing in Moscow and sensing that something was changing before anyone could prove it. And if you listen closely, you can hear that uncertainty in the song. The whistle does not sound like a victory parade. It sounds like someone walking alone at night, trying to believe the morning will come. It sounds simple, almost fragile. And that fragility is the magic. Klaus did not need a wall of guitars to begin the song. He needed a breath, a human breath, a sound anyone could make, a whistle. It was not German, it was not Russian, it was not American, it belonged to no flag. It was just human. And in a world exhausted by flags, that mattered. For the Scorpions, this was not just a creative breakthrough. It was an emotional turning point in a career built on survival. They had spent years proving they could be loud. Now they proved they could be gentle. They had spent years conquering stages. Now they captured a mood. They had spent years being judged as a German hard rock band trying to break into the English-speaking world. Now they wrote a song that seemed to belong to everyone. But behind that achievement was a private burden, because when a song becomes a symbol, it stops belonging only to the person who wrote it. Wind of Change became something people used to remember their own lives. For some, it was the sound of the Berlin Wall coming down. For others, it was the sound of sons returning from military service. For others, it was the sound of a world that, for one brief moment, seemed tired of hatred. And for many older listeners, especially those who lived through the Cold War, the song still carries a kind of emotional ache. It reminds them of a time when peace did not feel like a slogan. It felt like a miracle. That is why the Moscow story matters, because it shows that history is not only made in government buildings. Sometimes history is made in stadiums. Sometimes it is made by a crowd singing words they learned in secret. Sometimes it is made by a German singer looking out at Russian teenagers and realizing they are not the enemy. They are children of the same frightened century. They have simply been standing on opposite sides of the story. And that realization can change a man. Maybe Klaus returned from Moscow with more than memories. Maybe he returned with a responsibility to write something worthy of what he had seen. Not a song about the scorpions, not a song about fame, a song about the strange, beautiful possibility that the world could soften, that people could change before systems changed, that music could cross a border before politicians dared to. And when Wind of Change finally reached the world, it felt almost inevitable, as if the song had been waiting somewhere over Moscow all along, as if Klaus had not invented it, but heard it. That is the romantic version, of course. The truth was probably harder. Songs are work. They are doubt. They are repetition. They are private battles with lines that do not land and melodies that almost disappear. But the emotional truth remains. The seed was planted in Moscow, and the soil was history. When listeners heard the opening whistle, they did not need a lecture. They understood the feeling. Something was ending. Something was beginning. And no one knew whether to celebrate or cry. That is why the song became more than a hit. Hits come and go. Anthems stay. And Wind of Change stayed because it carried a memory that millions of people shared, even if they had never been to Moscow, never seen the Berlin Wall, never stood in a Soviet stadium beneath summer lights. It made people feel they had been there. Standing beside the Moskva, walking toward Gorky Park, listening to something in the air that could not be stopped. For Scorpions, the irony was profound. A band that had spent so many years fighting to be accepted by the West became one of the voices of reconciliation with the East. A German band, born from the ruins and shadows of the 20th century, gave the world one of its most unforgettable songs of peace, and perhaps only they could have done it, because they knew what history felt like when it lived inside a country. They knew what it meant to carry a passport that came with assumptions. They knew what it meant to prove that the next generation did not have to repeat the sins of the last. That is why Moscow was not just a concert. It was a mirror. The Scorpions looked into it and saw young Russians, but they also saw themselves. The young German boys they had once been, dreaming of music, dreaming of escape, dreaming that the world might be larger than the one they were born into. And on that night, in that stadium, those dreams met. No treaty could have arranged that feeling. No speech could have manufactured it. It happened because guitars were loud enough to drown out fear for a few minutes. It happened because young people are often braver than the systems that govern them. It happened because Klaus Meine was paying attention. That may be the real lesson of Wind of Change. Great songs do not always begin with ambition. Sometimes they begin with attention, with one man noticing a look in the crowd, a soldier relaxing his shoulders, a girl singing in a language she was never supposed to love, a city holding its breath, a world turning quietly beneath the noise. And then, later, when the hotel room is silent, the feeling returns. It asks to become a melody. It asks to become a line. It asks to become a whistle. Before Wind of Change, Scorpions were already legends of hard rock. After it, they became witnesses. Witnesses to a night when the Cold War did not end, but its heart seemed to weaken. Witnesses to a crowd that wanted something gentler than fear. Witnesses to the strange power of music to arrive before history has found the words. And decades later, that is why the story still matters, because the world has changed again. Hope feels more complicated now. Old tensions have returned in new forms. The innocence of 1989 can feel painfully distant, but maybe that only makes the song more important. Not because it promised that peace would last forever, but because it proved that people once felt it was possible. And if they felt it once, maybe they can remember it again. That night in Moscow did not belong only to Scorpions. It belonged to every person who ever lived through a divided world and wondered if the wall in front of them might one day fall. It belonged to every young fan who screamed into the Soviet night as if screaming could open the future. It belonged to Klaus Meine, standing before a crowd he had once been taught to fear, and realizing he was looking at human beings who wanted the same thing he wanted. A life without fear, a song without borders, a wind strong enough to move the world. And before the world heard Wind of Change, Scorpions heard it first. Not in a studio, not on a radio, but in Moscow, in the faces of young Russian fans, in the silence after the roar, in the impossible feeling that, for one night, history had stopped shouting and started listening. If stories like this remind you why classic rock still matters, subscribe to Scorpions' Untold Legacy. Because behind every anthem, there is a night the world almost forgot.